All right, welcome to topic number 8, the 8th and final topic in Unit 3, Political Parties, Interest Groups, and Mass Media. This is your last lesson in Unit 3. Today we'll be talking about interest groups. We'll be thinking specifically about what are the different types of interest groups, what categories can we fit them into, and then how do they get what they want? What do they do in order to do what they exist to do, which is to influence the government in their group's direction. So we'll start off with types of interest groups. Type number 1. We'll call them economic groups, meaning groups that are centered around what? Around making, buying, selling, and trading of goods and services. So they have something to do with business and making money. There are two broad subcategories of business groups. On the one side, you have groups that represent the workers. These are called labor groups. Labor unions, the obvious example. So labor unions are interest groups working on behalf of workers, fighting for what? The simple things: better pay, better or safer working conditions, better benefits, practical things like that. The largest labor union in the country, and has been so since the 1930s, it's got a long name. It's called the American Federation of Labor - Congress of Industrial Organizations. The AFL has been around since the 19-teens. CIO has been around since the 1930s, and they merged back in the middle of the 1900s. This is America's biggest union today, with over 10 million workers as members. Now that may seem like a lot, but the thing is, unions used to be more powerful than they are now. So if you go back to the 1950s and 60s, a large chunk of American workers were union members. So in 1956, for example, 1/3, 1 out of every 3 American workers were union. Today it's down to about 11%. Quick answer as to why that is. A couple of thoughts. Foreign competitors are selling their goods in the United States, so foreign steel, foreign oil, foreign car manufacturers, any type of manufacturing jobs, foreign competition is much higher than it used to be. And also the decline of Americans' own manufacturing industries. We just don't make as many actual products as we used to back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We've transitioned really to a service economy, where what people are buying is services more than actual things. The things these days are being made overseas more than they would have been 50 years ago. Now, sometimes labor unions will work out deals with businesses such that they can persuade this particular business to only hire union employees. The labor union's thinking is this: why do all the work that they're doing on behalf of workers if non-union workers can just come in, undercut them, work for less pay, work for lower benefits, undercut the union workers? So in that situation, that means as a worker, you would have to join the union in order to work at that business. So that kind of a that kind of a business where they'll only hire union employees is called a union shop. Now businesses, of course, generally speaking, would rather be free to hire whoever they want to not be a union shop. Maybe to be able to hire people for less pay than a union worker would require. So those types of businesses are fighting for what are called right-to-work laws, which prohibit union membership as a requirement to work at a business. Second type of economic group would be, yes, business groups. These represent business owners, whether they are large corporations, so think really big businesses. One interest group that represents them is the National Association of Manufacturers. That'll be big companies, Nike, companies like that. 14,000 member businesses. There are also interest groups representing smaller businesses, so the National Chamber of Commerce. If you have ever been in a small town in America in your life, somewhere in a small town there's going to be a little building where you can go in and get pamphlets about all the local restaurants and businesses and tourist places and all that. That little building is called the Chamber of Commerce. Well, there's a National Chamber of Commerce, and if you want to get your little pamphlets in those little buildings so people know to come to your restaurant or your business or whatever, you have to join the National Chamber of Commerce. There are 3 million member businesses. There are also interest groups for specific types of trades. So if you own a trucking company, the American Trucking Association, that's not a union. That's for people who own trucking companies. If you own a restaurant, not if you work at one, but if you own a restaurant, you might join the National Restaurant Association. So trade groups. Wait, oops, don't know why that happened. Okay, a second major type of interest group. First was economic groups. Then we have environmental groups. These are centered around, you might guess, environmental concerns of various different kinds. There are a large number of environmental groups in the U.S., over 10,000 such groups, and they have quite a bit of money to play with. Total revenues estimated at about $2.9 billion that they have to spend in order to get their concerns addressed. A couple of examples: the National Wildlife Federation. Maybe you've heard of the Sierra Club before. There are a number of different environmental interest groups. Third type of group would be what we could call equality groups. Equality groups. These are groups that are centered around ensuring equal protection of the law for various minority groups. Probably maybe the most famous example of all, going back to the 1920s, is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. A very large, powerful interest group in the U.S. fighting on behalf of, these days anyway, African Americans. It used to be a little bit broader, but nowadays you hear NAACP, you're thinking an interest group fighting on behalf of African Americans. There's also an organization called the National Organization for Women. Now, if you look at the title, it can be a bit misleading. You would think they speak for all American women. Well, not really. If you look at their website, they speak for politically liberal women. And a fourth type of interest group are called public interest groups. These are a little bit different. The first three have been representing some specific subset of Americans and their interest. Public interest groups are a little bit different. They claim to be seeking to advance or to protect a common good, something that will supposedly benefit all Americans, not merely their own set of members. A great example would be a group called Common Cause. They are fighting for, quote-unquote, better government, more citizen involvement, more democracy, less corruption. Another organization that would be a public interest group would be the National Consumer Law Center, fighting for consumers' rights, trying to protect people against predatory business practices. You have to be careful with public interest groups and actually look into them. They may be claiming to work for the benefit of all Americans, but you do have to actually research them and see if that's actually the case or if they're just claiming that in order to get a larger membership. Now, on to the activities of interest groups. How do they influence the government? What do they do? Well, the biggest activity, and this is what we'll spend most of our time, is called lobbying. You've probably heard that word before. What do we mean by that? Any actions taken by interest groups aimed at influencing governmental decision makers. So it's a broad category. Where did that name come from, the word lobbying? Well, in the olden days, if you wanted to wait to get a meeting with the president or your member of Congress, the only way you were sure of doing that would be literally to wait around in the lobby of whatever office building to make sure that you had contact with them. That's where the origin of the word is from. There are two basic types of lobbyists. The first are what we call regular paid professionals, like staff members who work for a particular interest group year-round, full-time job. And frankly, any interest group who has any kind of influence, who really wants to get anything done in and around Washington, D.C., is going to have regular paid professional lobbyists. There are other lobbyists who we could call temporary or sort of mercenary for-hire lobbyists. They can be used by interest groups maybe who can't afford a regular staff, or maybe just by an interest group who needs temporary expertise. More on lobbying. So what do lobbyists provide to governmental officials? You hear the word lobbyist sometime and you think, ooh, they're bad. They actually provide a number of helpful services to government officials. Number one, they provide information. Interest groups have, many of them anyway, have paid professional researchers whose job it is to put together information to give to the governmental officials in order to persuade them. Elected officials often don't have time to do their own research, and interest groups do have lots of time, and they are happy to provide it, though, of course, it's probably going to be information that's going to try to favor their view. The second thing that they provide, or that they can do, is that they can help officials get legislation passed. Many high-level lobbyists are former members of Congress, maybe even former White House staff, high-ranking officials in the government. Well, when they retire, they can work as lobbyists. And what that means is that they have a lot of personal relationships, a lot of personal networks that can help to grease the wheels and help elected officials get laws passed or help get policies put into place. Third, they can help officials get reelected. Lobbyists can work to galvanize, bring together their membership, and then encourage their membership to vote for this person who's up for re-election or vote against them if they have not voted in the interests of the interest group. And fourth, they can provide new ideas. Interest groups will very often suggest new legislation to members of Congress, or they will suggest policy initiatives to various different members of the executive branch. So they do have useful services. More on lobbying. So sometimes people ask, look, I mean, if you're making contributions to a person's campaign, if you are cajoling them into voting this way or threatening them with defeat if the member of Congress or whoever votes the wrong way, is that unethical? Is lobbying unethical? Is it just bribery? Well, I mean, it can be if it's done badly. I mean, obviously, if you offer a bribe, you're breaking the law. But, you know, threatening people, cajoling them, trying to say, look, if you don't do this, we're going to mobilize and get somebody else elected, is that a threat? Yeah, I suppose it is, but ultimately, isn't it up to the governmental official how they decide to receive that and how they choose to act on it? Do they have to say, okay? No, they don't have to. Sometimes they choose to, sometimes they don't. And to what degree does lobbying actually persuade people who disagree with you? Or maybe does it just provide support to those elected officials who are already on your group's side? Studies would seem to indicate that it's actually more the latter. Lobbying may not be quite so persuasive at getting people on the other side to join your side, but it certainly does strengthen and galvanize those who are already on your side. Second thing interest groups do is called electioneering, giving money to candidates' campaign funds. This is a big function of interest groups. This is done through political action committees, PACs. Sometimes PACs are part of an interest group. They can be a totally separate organization working hand in hand with an interest group. And any interest group that wants to succeed, that wants to influence the government, will give through their political action committee. We'll talk about why in a minute. Now, how much money can interest groups give? Aren't they just buying elections? Not really, if you look at how much they can give. They can only give up to $5,000 per candidate during primary season. And then after the primary season, during the general election season, they can only give $5,000 more. That's not very much, at least not individually. And oh, by the way, all this has to be done in the open, as per Federal Election Commission rules. So there's no secret political action committee giving. But here's the thing, candidates need money to win the election. And political action committees want to influence the government through these candidates should they win. So the candidates and the political action committees, and through them their interest groups, they need each other. So here's a statistic. Nearly half those running for re-election to the House of Representatives receive the majority of their campaign money from political action committee donations. Maybe only up to $5,000 per pop, but you add that up. This group, another group, another group, another group. It starts to add up pretty quickly. In 2012, interest groups and political action committees gave $288 million to incumbents, meaning the officials already in office. Only $41 million to new challengers. Why, you ask? Well, incumbents are already in office. They've already got personal connections. They've already got networks. They already have power and influence. So if you want to influence the government as an interest group, it would be better to try to work through them to get what you want. Third activity, litigation. All right, well, what if you can't get Congress to pass legislation on your issue? Well, then you can go to the courts. You can bring lawsuits against any part of the government that's acting in ways that are against your group's interests. Great example of this, 1950s civil rights movement. The NAACP was having trouble getting state legislatures, getting the federal government to take any action regarding segregation in the South. So the NAACP and the others worked through the courts. They ended up putting together a string of lawsuits, and in 1954, in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court said segregation is unconstitutional. A fourth activity, final activity, going public. Direct appeal to public opinion. Get citizens to contact their representatives, to contact members of the government, to help your interest group advance its interests. Work through the people. And work to make sure that your interest group's public image is positive so that citizens will support you. Maybe even join your group, and of course make donations and pay their dues. Great example of this, 2010. Congress is working on new health care legislation, Obamacare as it's become known. Many groups on both sides, both for and against, paid a lot of money to run TV ads appealing directly to American voters. I can remember those ads. Boy, were there a lot of them. All right, that is all for the final lesson in Unit 3. Take some good notes. Come to class ready. I will talk to you tomorrow.